8:15, all right? Thank you very much. And when you're giving your points of information, you can either use your hand or use the hand on the screen, whichever you feel is best. All right. Any questions before we begin?
Just to clarify, so we're not calling out points of information?
Yeah, you can call them out. You can call out point of information, or you can use your hand or use the hand at the top, whichever you think's best. Sometimes speakers don't hear the points of information. Look, you do whatever you're comfortable with, all right? Brilliant. Is everybody ready then? Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'd like to call on the first speaker for the proposition. Let's welcome James.
The seemingly unstoppable rise of the Eastern authoritarian regime that is the Chinese Communist Party has gone largely unopposed by the international community. We are the side in this debate that takes a stand against authoritarianism, takes a stand against the tyrannical regime of the Chinese Communist Party, and encourages global support the world over. The point that we will be presenting in this argument will follow as suit. It is the moral obligation of all nations to recognize harmful or immoral acts by belligerent nations. The second substantive will be covering how calling out China encourages more nations to support oppressed peoples the world over. And a third substantive will be covering that the CCP must be held accountable on the world stage. Now, briefly, before we move into our first substantive argument, I want to be covering the precedent that we want to be setting in international relations. The precedent we would be setting is that we would be calling out human rights violations, potential threats to national security of the country and that of our allies, such as in the Five Eyes community. Moving into our first substantive argument. It is the moral obligation of all nations to recognize harmful or immoral acts by belligerent nations the world over. Now, why is it our moral obligation? Now, in a nation which prides itself on maintaining a fair and democratic process, we need to be also helping those who are oppressed so that they may too also benefit from the same tenets that we ourselves benefit from in a system of democracy and these tenets are as such: freedom, justice, and equality for all. These are the tenets in which our very governing system is founded upon and which so many of the world go out. When we look towards upholding this moral obligation in the world, when we look towards furthering the agenda of giving people the opportunities of freedom, justice, equality for all, when we uphold that moral obligation, we are furthering the cause of international peace, unity, and safety across the world. We help the oppressed minorities who do not have a voice, who are unable to stand up to the authoritarian boot of regimes which wish to use them as a necessary political pawn in their political gains. This is what we stand for. When we help these people, we are giving them the opportunity to voice their concerns against a regime which is silencing as we stand. When we fail agenda, when we go to the negating side of the argument, we side with the oppressors. We side with the oppressors and further the agenda of those who do not have the best interests of all people in mind, who do not wish to give people freedom, justice, and equality. Moving into our second substantive argument, that the CCP must be held accountable on the world stage if we wish to have a safe and secure world. Now, 30 years ago, the CCP quashed peaceful protest with military force. These people, the Chinese citizens, wanted freedom, a voice, the opportunity of democratic reform. The people wanted a voice. This was the Tiananmen Square massacre, where China responded to this very peaceful protest with military force, sending in tank brigades, sending in armed soldiers to quell political protests because it infuriated them, because it undermined their authoritarian regime. The inaction of the nations of the world at the time to officially condone these brazen acts as a united body allowed China to continue to act against its citizens' best interests, allowed it to act against citizens of the world over. If we look at examples such as Hong Kong, political dissidents, and the Uyghur Muslim population, these are all examples of which China has continued under the precedent that has been set by the international community, that it can act against its own citizens without protest. I will take that point.
Why would China change based on what New Zealand says?
I will be getting to that in my third substantive argument, but so I'll continue going through that, and you will hear a response further down the line on that. Now, when we make sure that we are making sure that the voices of these people are heard, the people of Hong Kong, the Uyghur Muslim populations, and any political dissidents, what we do is we hold the CCP accountable for its immoral actions. When we are making sure that the citizens that are being attacked across the world, and specifically in incidents such as the South China Sea, where China is trying to assert military dominance over that region, we are giving nations which are terrified of China support and a voice. When we hold the CCP accountable, not only do we gain international clout amongst nations of freedom like New Zealand, we also make sure that we are taking a stand against humanitarian crisis the world over, and we also make sure we are taking a stand against a nation which has gone unopposed thus far, and we are making sure that they realize that what they are doing is morally wrong. This is worth doing because it makes us a nation with a voice on the world stage. We gain international clout, we gain reputation, and it puts us on the right side of history, the side that says it will not stand on the side of the oppressor. And through this, we gain the friendship and approval of substitute powers, such as the European Union, the United States of America, and the Commonwealth of Nations, nations which are able to support us in our endeavor, nations which are our allies and will help us through moving towards this goal of holding the CCP accountable. Moving into my third substantive argument here, that calling out China encourages other nations to fulfill their moral obligations. Now, if we look at international relations, it follows domino theory. When if one nation follows suit, more nations will follow. This is because when a nation stands up for what is right, it encourages other nations to follow suit, as they will no longer be alone in their voice. If we look at history when this has happened, when we look at incidents such as suffrage in the past, these are incidences in which one nation has been the catalyst for worldwide change, for worldwide opportunities. And in the incidents of suffrage, it was New Zealand that was the catalyst. So New Zealand does in fact have the power to enact change, to force these different perspectives to change for the better. Now, when we are being the voice of change, when we are enacting that domino theory, when we are making it so that other nations are changing in their perspectives because they no longer feel like they're isolated and alone in their voices, we gain further international support, which enables us to continue as a self-governing independent nation, which is not going to be constricted by being unable to support itself, because now we know we have allies, we are not alone in our fault. And if we look at other nations in these instances, the more nations that do this, the more nations that will follow. That is domino theory. If we look at nations that would already be willing to support us if we went forward with this endeavor, we look at nations such as Australia, which are currently being attacked on the cyber level and on the political level when they are when they're pushed out of the Chinese influence sphere. What we see is that this nation is a nation willing to support the effort of going against China. We are not alone in this endeavor. On the side of the house today, we are the side that supports people, individuals who are being oppressed by the authoritarian reach of the Chinese Communist Party. We are proud to propose.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to call on the first speaker of the opposition, and let's welcome Ronan.
It is clear to everyone in today's debate that China's actions towards Uyghurs, towards Hong Kong, in the Pacific, are abhorrent. We, however, are the side which is aware of the practicality of the situation and is actually trying to do something about it. What is truly morally wrong is to call China out when we know that these actions will hurt the very people we're trying to protect. It is moral entitlement at its worst. We believe that we will win today's debate if we either prove that China's harmful actions will be worsened by this policy, or that the negative impacts on New Zealand will be worsened without any change to China's actual actions. I'd like to begin my debate with some rebuttal of the first affirmative speaker. So they told us that we have a moral obligation to call out China always on every single thing they do. And we completely disagree with this, because we say, and this will be throughout my case, that even if we stand for the ideals of fairness and democracy, we have an obligation to take actions which actually lessen harm as much as possible. And taking actions which cause China to tighten their iron grip are morally abhorrent under their own framework, under what they've told us. They've also told us that we would be encouraging other nations to join us, but we disagree with that statement. We see that, like ourselves, every nation around the world has their hands tied diplomatically when it comes to China. The US and nations across the world rely on China. They're not going to change because one small, insignificant, politically lack of influential nation like New Zealand is going to stand up to it. China will simply quash any ability for other people to stand up to it. So the idea that we're going to encourage a spreading of anti-China thought is simply not true. Today, I'll be bringing two main points. Firstly, that our economic reliance on China means what our economic reliance on China means in relation to this policy. And secondly, what China's actual response to this policy will be. My first point, New Zealand is economically reliant on China, and calling them out will have flow-on effects economically and politically. New Zealand is a small nation. We are politically non-influential, and we are also economically reliant on China. So we see things across our exports, especially our dairy industry. We are hugely reliant on China. In terms of tourism, in terms of the international students who make up a large proportion of our university's income, in terms of immigration, we are hugely reliant on China. And what does that mean? We've seen this internationally. What did China do when people who are economically reliant on them call them out? Well, let's look at Norway. The Norwegian fish market, the salmon market, relied on exports to China. And so when the Norwegian Nobel Peace Prize Committee decided to give the Peace Prize to a Chinese activist, what did China do in response to that? They completely cut off the Norwegian fish market. They said, we're not taking exports from you anymore. We're going to go elsewhere, which they can do. Even if it's more expensive to them, China can take that. Even if it's less premium, China can decide to do that because they value their own political and moral abhorrency. And so what do we see in Norway now? Norway's economy was crippled. And Norway is far less likely now to stand up and say things to China. And that's going to be the same thing that happens to New Zealand. What are our options under ASWorld if China reduces its trading with us, which it will do in response to this calling out? We can see that we can shift to things like the EU, the UK, or the US possibly. But why do we say that this is worse? Firstly, economically for New Zealand, it is far worse. So Western countries are a far reduced export market. It's smaller initially, so we're going to have far less demand. So New Zealand will be hurt by this economically. And often these nations already have the goods that we want to export. So EU relies on the French dairy products, which is why we've shifted away from trade to the EU and towards China, which is more economically lucrative. So what do we see happening? We're also going to see less tourism, far less tourism, because China can simply say, don't go to New Zealand, go elsewhere for tourism, which they do and they have done in their state media in the past. And so the effects on our rural dairy farmers, on our tourism industry, which rely on China, are going to be massive. And this is extremely important to New Zealanders. Secondly, the second impact of this is that we actually reduce our bargaining power. So if we maintain economic ties with China, we maintain a seat at their table. So in instances where we actually feel like we really do need to call China out, we have more influence. So because we have that economic connections, we can actually do that. If we're completely separate from them, if we have alienated ourselves from China, China will not listen to us. Because they'll see us as part of just a Western bloc. And this is extremely important because this allows us to make the changes that we see, we actually want, rather than simply standing for morals and not actually changing anything. And that leads me on to my second point. If we continue to call out China, they will actually double down on their own policies, which we stand against. What do we see currently in Xi Jinping's China? It is aggressive. It moves to consolidate its power across the world. And we see things like this happening with the Belt and Road Initiative across Africa, and its movements towards the South China Sea, as they brought up, and it's in Hong Kong and towards Taiwan. And so ACT have conceded this. They've said that China is extremely aggressive. They've told us all these same things. So we say that there are two scenarios if we continue to call out China. The first is the best case scenario, and we see it as less likely to happen. This is the best case scenario when we call out China, is that it has no influence on China. China does not care about New Zealand's small, weak political influence. And what that means is that when we call them out, they do not change their behavior. They continue to commit genocide towards the Uyghurs. But what we do see on this side is the economic harms caused by China's response to us. So they say, no, we don't like you, we're not going to trade with you, and they continue what they're doing. And we do not stand for this. The second outcome, which we see as being more likely, is, and we see already starting to happen, is that China perceives New Zealand as a threat or as more resistant to their policies. And what are their actions going to be because of this? Firstly, they're going to, out of a sense of need to show their power, because this is what Xi Jinping does. They see backing down as a concession. They see, if we call them out, they see responding that that's a concession. So what they need to do instead is show their power. So when the world's governments have called out actions at Hong Kong, what did China do? They crack down on Hong Kong. They need to show how powerful China is. China feels the need to flex its muscles. They need to expand in the South China Sea. And we see this impacting New Zealand too, because we see things like Marianne Brady, the professor, calling out Chinese influence in New Zealand, having her house broken into. We see China trying to meddle in our elections and install CCP agents in our parliament. So what that means is we're less able to call it out if we're more politically influenced by China. By calling out China's harmful actions, we risk far more than we gain. We lose our sovereignty, we lose our very livelihoods, and we gain nothing for the oppressed people that Side Affirmative claim to protect. Proud to oppose.
But you said was that if we at the bargaining table by calling them out, we get changes. So if they pick on that up, and they could be a problem. But I guess we've already got some space.
Guys, mute yourselves.
Kahurangi, can you just mute? Thank you very much. I'd now like to call on the second speaker of the proposition, and let's welcome Ola.
Can you hear me okay? Yes. Yes, okay, cool. We are taught from childhood to confront and stand up to a bully, because no one has the right to harm and belittle others. We also step in when we see this happening, because we accept that this desecrates someone's human rights and their freedoms. And if we can all accept that this principle stands here, then why would it not apply to international relations with China? I will be giving you a split on why we need to stand up to China to establish a degree of control for us to actually get any benefits from our relationship with them. But first, let's look at the points of clash in today's debate. So the first point of clash is, would our policy of calling China out actually benefit people on the world stage, and would it benefit the vulnerable groups that are actually being oppressed in China currently? So what we heard from the negating team on this is that us calling China out would actually like strengthen their iron grip, and that we wouldn't do it anyway because our hands are tied. And even if we did, that us calling them out would have like no effect whatsoever because we're just not an influential nation. But actually that's completely untrue, and we do not accept that narrative, because the fact is China actually cares about their reputation. So if our nation was to start calling China out, they would actually run the risk of the UN like condemning them, and they would also run the risk of the entire world community condemning them, because the fact is, like what we heard from my first speaker is this domino effect. So people, we generally accept like what is happening in China right now with like the Uyghur population is entirely morally abhorrent. So like New Zealand started calling China out, Australia would also have a stake in calling them out too, because like Australia is our big brother and they're also being affected by what China is doing to them, particularly with the conflict in the South China Sea. So actually what would happen is the world community would actually be inspired to actually start creating change, and that would be bad for China, right? Because what China relies on to remain this world power is that it needs to actually be able to trade with people. So if it was condemned by the UN and it was condemned by the world community, then that would no longer happen for them. And if we were united against China, that would have like very bad effects for China. So if people started calling them out like us, and if it started with a small nation like us, this would actually have a very like big run-on effect that the negating team actually just like wants to ignore. So, and we also know that when people are like called out and they're challenged for their behavior, they actually do think about what is going to happen if I just continue to do what I'm doing currently. And China would think about that, and they would think, actually, the potential here is that like the United States could also challenge me, because like they have a stake in the Western power, which includes New Zealand. And so you actually would get this run-on effect that would have like a very high risk factor for China that they would want to avoid. So we think that it actually would benefit communities like the Uyghur population, because what we should be doing right now is other countries should be talking about why putting people in concentration camps and forcing them to like donate organs is actually just like horrible, and we don't want to go back to World War II, and we like definitely don't want that to happen. So to move on to the second point of clash is like which side of the house actually provides benefit for New Zealanders. So basically what the negating team has said, that we're so economically reliant on China that we just need to shut up, and we just like can't say anything about China, because if we did, we would like lose like this economic advantage that we have. But actually we think it's unlikely that China would like cut New Zealand off entirely, because what we know is that New Zealand actually does provide mutual benefit to China, and there is some stuff that they actually need from us. And the fact is China actually does want to establish like great trade like across the world, and so they'd be unlikely to like cut all ties from us. But even if they did, we have strong alliances with other countries like America, Australia, all the Commonwealth nations, and Japan. And because we've actually taken a moral stance with these countries, we're in a far better position to strengthen our like trade alliances with them and continue to like this road of success for our own trade and economy with these nations. So we shouldn't be like so scared of China that we just like can never say anything, because the reality is that we are not like fully like indebted to China, that we can never say anything, and like the fear that China might like cut us off, because even if they did, if we take like the negating team at their best, and even if they did, we think it's we would be able to survive because of the other strong alliances we have. And this moves on to my split point, but before I go into that, I'll take a point of information.
the entire world called out China of the Hong Kong protests and their handling of it, and that is still going on. Why is this not? Why is this explained by your?
Basically, what we're saying is that right now, the world population isn't like pushing hard enough and it's not challenging China enough to make change, which is what we're saying needs to happen, which is why we would put in the policy that we would challenge China. So to move on to my split point, we need to establish control in our relationship in order for New Zealand to be able to benefit. So to highlight the necessity and the value of adopting a policy like this, let's take a moment to compare the two worlds. So in Neg's world, what would happen is New Zealand would remain China's doormat, and we would allow China to treat its citizens and our citizens however they want, because we're just too scared to stand up and say anything. So we're this like silent participant that China doesn't respect at all, because they know we're just going to like remain like a puppy in the corner. So what would happen in this world is that China would continue to push us into a position that benefits them and disadvantages us. And China, like, we know we're dealing with a country that doesn't mind treating and oppressing people. And so it's not so far-flung to suggest that they would do this to New Zealand if we continue to let them. Like, what about if New Zealanders become the next Uyghur population? Like, I think we would all be like highly alarmed if we started being forced into concentration camps and our organs were being taken by the Chinese. Like, I think we would all, like, we all have a stake in not wanting that to happen, right? So in our world, we would like strengthen like our stake in international affairs, because China would have a greater respect for us because they know we're going to stand up for ourselves and like prioritize our citizens' needs. And so they're more likely to like give us the respect of offering us great partnerships that are like based on mutual respect, because they know that we're supported by the world community and not wanting them to treat us this way. And so we actually like achieve like a unique benefit on that side of the house, because like China knows that they can't just like push us around, because we're not going to allow them to, and we have the support of the world community to do this, which is why it is necessary for the moot to stand.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to call on the second speaker of the opposition. Let's welcome Ella. are we doing there? Are we ready to go?
Almost, yeah, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
The negating team in today's debate love to talk about things like the domino effect, New Zealand looking strong, New Zealand not being a doormat, other countries leading by New Zealand's example. But let's take this debate back to the real practical outcomes for both people oppressed by China, such as Uyghur Muslims and Hong Kongers, and the New Zealand economy and people within New Zealand as a whole. So, 3 points of clash today, followed by a split. Firstly, does calling out China actually work? Secondly, would this move be beneficial for our economy? And thirdly, would it be beneficial for our sovereignty and the democratic nature of our political process in general? Then I'm going to go on to my split about why New Zealand under the status quo is in a unique position. We have a dual alliance with the US and the Western world and China and the benefits that this brings us. But firstly, does calling out China work? So we told you at first that China likes to look strong. It likes to look authoritative. It is consolidating its power in places like Central Asia, in the Pacific, over Hong Kong and Taiwan. It likes to look like it has zero tolerance for anyone else's subversion or criticism.
Point of information.
What did we hear in response from the negating team? We heard that China actually does care about its reputation. What were our responses to this? Firstly, that if China really cared about its reputation being one of a good actor, which never committed human rights atrocities and never tried to consolidate its power in Africa, Central Asia, or the Pacific, then it would react to the fact that the world is already well aware of China's atrocities by Muslims, that the UN and other actors are already committing the genocides.
Point of information.
Already condemning the genocides that China is committing, that countries are already making statements condemning China. So we see that China actually doesn't really care about its reputation for being the good guy, right? But what reputation do they actually care about? They care about being perceived as strong. They care about being perceived as impenetrable and unable to be
information.
Weaker actors on a world stage. This means that in terms of reputation, they're more likely to do things which consolidate this image, such as doubling down on their atrocities and becoming more aggressive. And they talked about the domino effect, right? They said, well, if New Zealand calls them out, then so will everyone else. So we've got kind of 3 scenarios for what will happen.
Point of information.
Under this, in response to this. So firstly, we say that it's unlikely that we get widespread diplomatic approval or clout, as the F team would like to put it, from lots of other countries for a few reasons. Because A, these countries either have their hands tied diplomatically because they themselves rely on trade and good relations with China, right? These even include countries like the UK and Norway, which had its fish market destroyed. That also B, countries that rely economically and institutionally on China because that China is propping them up through initiatives such as the Belt and Road, such as Pacific Island nations or countries in Central Asia or
Point of
Africa.
information.
Third, even in the best case scenario, some countries that do approve of New Zealand's calling out and follow in their footsteps. But But why is this not an important benefit in the debate? Because the affirming team still hasn't proved that even
Point of
if
information.
Scandinavian countries and Australia get behind New Zealand and like give them friendship and approval, they still haven't proved how that doesn't either maintain or exacerbate China's aggression and consolidation of power in the Pacific and over Uyghurs. We are the only team which have provided mechanisms for like how the AF case will like consolidate this aggression. So secondly, we go on to benefits the New Zealand economy. We told you that because
Point of information.
we told you that because we are reliant on exporting to China in many sectors, such as in dairy products, such as in tourism, such as in our international student market, that calling out China all the time would absolutely would cause China to withdraw from the extent of like economic agreement it has with us at the moment and absolutely cripple our economy. So what did we hear in response to this? We told you that they told us, that that's okay because we can actually strengthen our alliances with Western countries, such as the US and the UK. So why is this not the case? We gave analysis at first that like restricting our like global export market, which is currently both China and the Western world, as I'll go over in my split, to just China, both restricts the size of our market and is unlikely to be filled by and expanded in other ways because like our niches, such as like premium dairy products, are already filled.
Point of information.
We'll simply get like less Chinese tourism, like which can't be like replaced by the UK. We will get a smaller influx of like Chinese international students. This is not something that an alliance with the Western world, an increased alliance with Western countries.
Point of information.
Thirdly, then, on impacts on New Zealand's sovereignty, we told you in our first speech that because if New Zealand decided to call out China, then China and not be like, if New Zealand decided to call out China, then in fact China will be more incentivized to meddle in our elections and undermine our sovereignty, so that in the future New Zealand has less political capital with which call out China in the future. We gave you strong mechanisms for how this would occur. What did we hear in response to this? We did not hear very much, except for the fact that China pushes us around under status quo because it knows we're a doormat and it would like strong trading partner. We think this is a gross mischaracterization, especially because there's real tangible evidence that when countries aren't doormats to China, they end up their economies, such as their fish markets, end up being absolutely crippled. Really quickly onto my split then about how we're in a unique position where we have a dual alliance with both the US and China. So at the moment, not only do we have a substantial export market to China, we also are in things like the Five Eyes Allowance and the NZSDC agreement, right? And undermining our relations with China means that China will kind of pull out of this and will be solely reliant on Western nations. And this is important because under the status quo, we maximize our economic prosperity, we maximize our defensive outcomes, and because we're a small country and we don't have a lot of bargaining power, we need as many alliances and support in these areas as possible. Proud to negate.
We now come to the substantive speeches. I'd like to call upon the third speaker of the proposition to continue her team's argument.
New Zealand has the power to stand up to China in a way that has never done before, and this will ultimately bring us both national and global benefits that we desperately need. 2 points of clash for you today. First of all, what the impact China has on the oppressed peoples it has power over, and secondly, the economic reliance that we share with China. Let's firstly begin by looking at what happens in the current situation where we allow China to use us essentially as a political and economic doormat. So in the status quo, when we communicate and negotiate with China, New Zealand holds absolutely no power because we refuse to call them out on things that are inherently harming us and other nations that we are allied with. Under the negating team side of the house, China is allowed to have this complete abuse of power over New Zealand and other nations, which means ultimately our citizens and our people and the state of our nation is inherently harmed. So what happens under our side of the house when we actually take up China and say to it, we don't stand for what you're doing? Well, first of all, what we see is we actually get better outcomes for our nation. We now have the power to speak up when we see something that is not right, instead of going along with China's ideas like the political doormat we have been for all of time. We now have the power to have a stake in important global decisions that ultimately affect us. We're able to say, actually, this is our stake in this, and we disagree with what you're doing. This is really important as an independent nation because we are here to represent the best interests of our people, not China's. We need to actually first be standing up for our people and not just going along with whatever China wants us to do for their own political benefit. And this is important because China, as we've seen in our second speech, has the power to turn us into its next victim if we don't start making a reputable standpoint from New Zealand's point of view. Now let's move into our first point of clash. We've talked about today the impact that China has on the oppressed peoples that it currently has power over. Now, the negating team has told us, actually, essentially, we should do nothing because we risk China doing something worse. So they basically say we should allow these oppressed people to continue suffering because we are too afraid to make a stand and try to strive for what's right. This is inherently wrong. The negating team has given us no way to help these people. And we think in a time of humanitarian crisis, it's actually really important for us as someone on the global stage to stand up and say, this is wrong, and we are going to make the first move and making a stand about this. Now, why does this work? First of all, it puts a global spotlight on China. It shows on a global stage that one nation is calling them out. So in this case, New Zealand is calling out China and telling them this is wrong. On the global stage, this first of all gets us a name and shows us what is happening and what is going wrong. Second, when we start to actually move into this and make steps to oppose China's wrong points of view, we create the domino effect that we saw at first. Other nations, once they see that we have made a stand, they are going to do the same because it is within their best interest to actually protect the human rights of other people. Now, why is this? Because most of these nations, including China, are actually a member of the UN, and that for China is really important. Why? Let's look at China's UN membership now. If China loses their UN membership, they ultimately lose all of the trade powers that they have ever held. And this is inherently bad for them. UN nations have the best interest to actually protect the human rights of people. Henceforth, they will side with New Zealand when New Zealand tries to solve this humanitarian crisis, as the UN is actually already doing, you may have noticed. And we'll be able to move forward as a global community to actually try and help these oppressed peoples of China. And if China tries to resist this by continuing to oppress people, it will lose its UN membership, which it cares a lot about, and therefore its reputation as a global power and global trade power will be lost. And this will inherently undermine China so much that it will actually think about its actions and stop oppressing people. This is the outcome that we as unique to our side of the house. And this is why we actually really need to uphold this mood here. Now let's quickly look at how this has worked for us historically. So if we look at the suffrage movement, New Zealand, little old New Zealand, who the negating team says can do absolutely nothing, was the first nation to allow women to have the vote. Women at that time were the oppressed minority, and everyone was just leaving them to suffer because, you know what, we don't want to stand up and do anything. But little old New Zealand made those first steps and actually sparked a global movement. And now look at us. Women have more political power than they've ever had before. And that is simply because we decided that we could make a stand. Now, think about what the great benefits of this are. If we do this for other oppressed minorities, it is our moral duty to actually try and help other people within our global society. Even though there's one big monster that is China oppressing them, don't you think it is actually inherently better to stand up to that monster and help these people, these stakeholders that we ultimately care a lot more about, because it is something that we as a nation need to do. Now let's now quickly move into the economic reliance that we share with China. Now what we've heard from Ned today is that if we tried anything, China would just completely cut off economic trade with us, and that we'd lose absolutely everything. This is untrue. We need to remember also that China, because it wants to dominate the global trade market, actually relies on us to be a part of that for them. And if they're deciding to cut us off from the global market, this has inherent harm to them. First of all, we look at our allies and what they will do if they cut us off. Because we've made it clear before that by standing up to China, we actually don't agree with their policies. Other countries such as America, who also disagree with what China's doing, are more likely to follow suit and also cut them off from the trade war. We've already seen this in America. If America disagrees with China, it will implement aspects of trade that actually harm them in order to get back at them. What's to say that America won't do this again with us? We have good reason to believe they actually will, so that China is actually now not inclined to harm us because they know that our allies will actually come and snap back at them for anything they try to do. We actually gain a bit of leverage here over them and can actually try and help better the state of our global community without the losses that the negating team is trying to say we will find. Also links back to losing the UN membership. If China does something to us, we feel like we have the correct backing of allies in such a way that they could potentially lose their UN membership and lose their trade, which is inherently harmful to them. However, if we say, let's take the negating team at their best, if anything was to happen and China was able to cut us off from some aspect of trade, they would firstly face all of those harms. But what we think is that New Zealand as a nation, because we have such a good global relationship with other countries, we think we would actually still be able to sustain economic trade in such a way that we would still be able to re-establish and continue the uphold of our economy. We don't actually think that what the negating team is saying will happen is plausible, and hereby we think it is ultimately better that we do something now as a nation. We stand up to China, make a respectable case for our country that stops us from being a political doormat, stops the oppression of oppressed peoples that are under the tyranny of China, and actually creates better global outcomes for everyone in the global community. We think this is incredibly important, and these are the benefits that we only see under our side of the house. We need to gain this political leverage and power for the good of our nation and other nations, and those people who ultimately we have to care about as a part of the global community. And this is why today, speakers, the move must stand.
Ready? All right. We want to stop China's heinous actions, but we want to do it in the most intelligent, effective way. And this means picking our battles, not drawing their ire. We see two main points of clash in this debate: the challenges to China, or changes in China, sorry, and the harms to New Zealand. So starting with potential changes in China. The affirming team was talking about how China could, for example, lose their UN membership, and this would harm them. But firstly, China is part of the Security Council. They have veto power. They cannot lose their membership. So China is going to remain part of the UN anyway. Additionally, the UN is toothless. So if they somehow did, they would still be fine. And thirdly, China is a major power. They're going to be fine either way. They've got economic, military, population, land, power over everyone else, particularly New Zealand. So they're going to be fine either way. They tried to suggest that, for example, we'd start a domino effect, and that like other countries would copy us. But first of all, as I pointed out in one of my POIs, we already did this with the Hong Kong protests. They're still happening. In fact, they're happening even worse, as we've been explaining. China has cracked down on the Hong Kong protesters even worse to show that they are not weak. They will not cower to the rest of the world, because to them, resistance is a red flag. It shows that they have to come up, they have to rise above it and become stronger. And that is a bad thing, because rising up, becoming stronger means oppressing people more, which is what we want to stop. They also, they talked more about how, like, you know, other countries are going to copy us through this domino effect. And they like to talk about the suffrage movement. But first of all, diplomatic, that doesn't have, like, letting women vote in your country doesn't have diplomatic and economic repercussions like angering China does. Additionally, that was going to happen anyway because of similar advances in communication and power of women around the world, leading to them wanting to have a vote. And
Point of information.
The world relies on China's trade. And I'll say that again, the world relies on China's trade. It's so essential to everyone's economy that if China was angry, they could just cripple us. And so that is why the domino effect will not occur. China has, you know, we don't have any power over China. We can't affect changes. We've got a population of 4.5 million. They have a population of 1.4 billion. They have so much more money than us, so much more land, military power, soft power through their allies they've bought. China has more power than us, and so we cannot cause them to change. Additionally, if China sees us as an enemy who always opposes them, we're not going to listen to them. You don't listen to the guy who critiques every single thing you do, because they're just doing it because they don't like you. Because whereas if, for example, sometimes you say they're quiet, when they do speak, those words are even louder, even more important. Additionally, as Ella and Ronan have explained, if China sees us as a separate but favorable third party, they're more likely to listen to us because we have a seat on the bargaining table, right? We can actually cause change to happen more. And so this is important because we want to cause these changes, but that doesn't happen under the affirming side of the model, under the affirming side of the case. China will cripple our economy, ignore us, and move on. No change happens. Whereas under our side, we actually get help with the oppressed people we care about, and that is a good thing. And we've won this because, you know, we've shown that we can actually keep some power over China. You know, we can actually get China to listen to us, unlike the affirming side, in which China would block us and move on. On the next point about the harm to New Zealand, even if China does nothing even if China doesn't make it worse on the Uyghur population or the Hong Kong population or whatever, even if they don't make it worse, it's still going to be bad under the affirming side of the case because it's going to harm New Zealand. China, as I've explained earlier, China has all of the power over us. They've got the money. Our economy relies on them, for example, things like international students, tourism. I'll take that later. And so China has the power over us. It's not just economic power. They've also got the military and the land and the significant population. So China can do what they want to us without being affected. And as Ronan said, this happened with the Norwegian fish market. They angered China, and China simply stopped buying their fish. No one in China cared. China itself didn't care, and Norway was crippled. That's not a good thing. We don't want that. Now Norway is not going to criticize China. That's a bad thing, right? Then when they're not going to cause change, that's a bad thing. We help that. Ella talked more about the Chinese influence over sovereignty and how, for example, if China sees us as a constant threat, they're more likely to take action against us. And we've seen this, for example, for the car crash of people going to the select committee to report on China's actions, or the professor whose home was raided and her laptop was stolen. These were people who were opposed to China, and they faced action against them in New Zealand. there's already some threats against our sovereignty. And so we do not want to encourage more by angering China, because remember, angering China is a red flag to them. They will turn it up more. They will become
Point of information.
And so the reason we don't see it happening right now, because we have allies. And we remain independent, right? But if we are constantly opposing China, those we're going to lose some of our Pacific allies. We're going to lose some other Asian allies, right? And that is a problem. China is going to scare them away. They're going to and then they can attack us. They can harm our sovereignty.
Point of information.
For New Zealanders, and it places us in a weaker position. We can, as it stands, we can play China and the United States off each other to get better outcomes this way, as has been explained earlier. But when we constantly anger China, we only turn to Europe or the United States, and therefore we can't negotiate as effectively, because they're really our only option. Whereas by playing in the middle, right, by remaining
Last chance. Point of information.
Yes.
How do you propose we stop China from abusing their power over other nations and their people if someone doesn't call them out?
First of all, we can sometimes call them out, but calling them out every single time just makes China ignore us, because we're the critique. Additionally, we have more power under our side to cause these changes, to actually place pressure on China in smaller areas to actually cause these changes. So we get more under our side of the house. So yeah, it puts us in a weaker position to actually negotiate with China, and that isn't why we don't want it. At the end of it, and this is important because we don't want to harm New Zealanders. We care about New Zealanders, and so if we're not going to make anything better over there, we shouldn't make it worse for people over here. And we've won this because we've shown that China has the power over New Zealand. China will be influencing our sovereignty if they don't like us, and we don't want to put ourselves in a weaker position. At the end of this debate, we've shown that we're going to make things worse in China and worse in New Zealand. There's no reason to do it. Proud to negate.
We now come to the leader's reply. And of course, as is tradition, we start with the reply of the opposition, then moving on to the reply of the proposition. So I'd like to welcome back Ella to summarise her team's argument. 4 minutes with a warning at 3.
Sorry, I always forget to turn my mute off for the leader's reply. Make no mistake, when we are the side which, make no mistake, when we are the side which provides New Zealand with a seat at China's table, we're the side which prevents China from doubling down on its atrocities in Hong Kong and towards Uyghur Muslims, when we're the side which strengthens our economic ties with China and protects our sovereignty to an increased degree, we win this debate. 2 points of clash in today's case. Firstly, which side of the House provides the best outcomes for victims of China's aggression? What do we tell you down the bench? We said that first of all, we don't have to prove that China will stop oppressing people from outside the House. We don't have to prove that all Uyghurs will be released from concentration camps, Hong Kong will be a free nation. We just have to prove that the comparative will be even worse, that China, under their side of the House, will double down and accelerate the atrocities which they are currently committing. We told you that New Zealand calling China out would be interpreted as an affront to their consolidation of power, which is very valuable to China's image, right? We told you that this would result in China doubling down in places like the Pacific, in places like Hong Kong, in places like Taiwan and the Pacific. We saw this We saw this in Norway when they gave the Nobel Peace Prize to a Chinese democracy activist and they crippled their salmon economy. We saw this when US tried to retaliate and China forced them to remove their embassies from Chengdu. What did we hear in response to this? They said that actually China will yield to our demands because China would look strong and not a doormat. We just told you that this is an extremely unlikely characterization since China doesn't like strong resistant countries which threaten its image and its prospect of subservient world domination, right? We saw this in places like Norway. We saw this in Central Asian countries when they tried to protest the Belt and Road Initiative. We just kind of dismissed that characterization and thus that analysis. Secondly, they told us about the domino effect, that if we support China, then loads of other countries will too, and this will eventually apply enough pressure to get China to yield. So we gave you a few scenarios of what would happen in that case. Firstly, that it was unlikely since most countries are economically or diplomatically tied to sucking up for China, just like us. And despite Trump's tweets, the US is quite reliant on China for trade. It can't just cut it off. And secondly, even if there was a chorus of dissent from countries which oppose China, this would increase the doubling down. The NEG team provided the ACT team provided no clear mechanism for why this would produce a positive outcome that would overcome the harms that this doubling down would produce. See, they talked about the removal of China from the UN. This is impossible because China has a seat on the Security Council. So what did we tell you on the point of economy and sovereignty? Firstly, we say that our economic reliance on China is so intimate that if we stop relying on China, that would have such a huge impact on the economy and the livelihoods of people such as dairy farmers, and also the ability of officials to democratically represent our constituents because of the undermining and sovereignty, that it's important that even if we can't prove that China doubles down and produces worse harms to Hong Kong and stuff, we still get these harms alongside a maintenance of the status quo for international members of the international community. We still win this debate. So we told you that we need China, but China doesn't need us. Their incentive to look strong will as we've clarified throughout our case, would override the slightly higher cost of turning to other countries for dairy products. Thanks, proud to negate.
And to conclude this morning's debate, let's welcome back the proposition to summarise its team's case. Thank you, Orla.
Can you hear me okay? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. The point at which the negating team told you New Zealand has absolutely no influence was the point at which they lost this debate. So we won this on 3 points of clash. The first major point of contention is whether China would actually be forced to change their behaviour if we were to implement this policy of always calling them out. And the material that we got from NEG on this and the narrative they were giving you was that we actually just our voice doesn't matter because we're small. And what we told you on this is that we actually do have considerable influence and that we can be the start of a domino effect, which we were for women's vote. And right now we have an influential female leader who is on the world stage and is leading the fight against COVID essentially. And all eyes are on us. So we actually do have considerable influence on the world stage. And we also have influence in the United Nations because we are a member of it. And what they tried to tell you is that this material didn't stand up because China is a member of the Security Council and they can't lose their spot. But what we tell you is that that is actually not true, because China's predecessor, the Republic of China, actually did lose its seat on the Security Council. So we tell you that China actually does care about its reputation, and that it relies on the United Nations membership to be able to trade and negotiate with big countries like the United States. And if they were to lose their membership because people like New Zealand are calling them out, then big countries like the United States would be unlikely to want to negotiate and trade with them, which would be like highly crippling for China, and something that China would not want to do, which would mean that they were backed into a corner and forced to like adhere to the United Nations assertions that they need to change the way they're like treating people like the Uyghur population. And that's a very practical stake. It would mean that people in China that are being oppressed right now would actually be going into a world where they are more respected and they have like a greater quality of life. And we heard no solutions from the negating team about how that would happen on their side of the house, because they just simply wanted us to sit back and just continue to let it happen because we're too scared to say anything. So the second point of clash was who has the greatest benefit for New Zealand. And what we heard at third is that it wouldn't be a benefit for New Zealand to always call out China, only sometimes. And one that actually contradicts their entire case, because what their narrative was that we should like never speak up and always be a silent participant. And two, like let's just take them at their best for a moment. We say that it would actually like not give any benefits if you were only to sometimes do it, because it would be such a half-hearted attempt that there wouldn't be enough pressure on China to make that change. And you would only get this negative of China being annoyed that someone is like trying to make this half-hearted attempt at making them change. And so we wouldn't get the benefits that we want on this side of the house, which is increased respect because we have the support of the world community, because we're taking a strong moral stance, and which would mean that we have a seat at the table that is a vocal one, so that we are able to voice our needs and requirements, so that we are getting the best possible future for our citizens and protecting them in the best possible way. The last point was on like the economic fallout, which we proved falls out of this debate, because like one, it is unlikely that China would cut all ties with us because they want to establish world trade. And second of all, like we proved to you that we do have other trade alliances with like Commonwealth countries and America, which means that we wouldn't like fall into this economic pit of like hellfire where like, you know, like we're all disadvantaged, which is why like we are on the right side of history, which is why the moot must stand.
Thank you very much, everybody. We're going to retire, obviously.